Good morning, and thank you all for joining the meeting to discuss the revised draft final proposal for Phase 1 of the EIN Resource Sufficiency Evaluation Enhancements Initiative. I'm Christina Osborne with ISO Stakeholder Engagement Team. I'll be providing support for the meeting. The proposal and presentation are posted out on the initiative webpage. So after I go over the meeting logistics, we actually have Anna McKenna, who is the Vice President of Market Policy and Performance, here to provide some opening remarks. Then she'll turn it over to Danny Johnson, who is the policy lead for this initiative. He is going to provide a summary of the stakeholder comments that we received on the draft final proposal, and then he'll review the details of the revised draft final proposal. And then I'll go over the decisional designation and the next steps at the end of the presentation. We do have a few other ISO subject matter experts who are on the phone, and they're available to help respond to questions. They're listed as panelists to the right of the screen. Let me flip to the stakeholder process slide. So this graphic depicts ISO stakeholder process. As it shows here, we are in the draft final proposal phase in the process. We are planning to take the proposal to the joint governance meeting in February for decision. There is a more detailed schedule at the end of the presentation, which I'll review with you later. There will be opportunities to ask questions. You can either ask those verbally, or you're welcome to send them in the chat to all panelists, and I'll provide instructions for how to raise your hand when we're ready to open up for questions. We are recording the meeting, and we'll post the video file out on the initial webpage for informational and convenience purposes only. And just as a reminder, please contact the ISO before reprinting any related transcriptions. So with that, I'd like to turn the meeting over to Anna McKenna. And just a reminder to unmute yourself, Anna.
Yes, thank you, Christina, and good morning, everyone. Can everybody hear me?
We can.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Resource Sufficiency Evaluation Enhancements stakeholder meeting to discuss the ISO's revised draft final proposal. And before we go any further, I did want to take a moment to thank you all for being here today and for your active and helpful participation in this and all of our stakeholder meetings this past year. It's been a very busy year at the ISO in developing policy, and on behalf of everyone at the ISO, I want to thank you all for attending the many stakeholder meetings we have had this year, submitting multiple sets of comments, and providing us the feedback and input we need to really develop good, solid market rules. So with regards to this particular initiative, after concerns were identified in light of last year's in August 2020, there were some concerns with the performance of the resource efficiency evaluation during tight system conditions. Well, in light of those concerns, we set out to address and consider any enhancements we might have to make to improve the accuracy of the tests and the series of the tests and the resource efficiency evaluation. Our goal was to determine whether enhancements were needed, and we started with what is the purpose of the test. And just as a little reminder, the purpose of the resource efficiency evaluation is to ensure that EIM entities are able to meet their demand with their own supply prior to engaging in transfers with other balancing authority areas through the EIM, so that the EIM entities can mutually benefit from the economic diversity available to them by participating in the EIM. So we kind of that's sort of our goal, our beacon, if you wish, as to what we are trying to achieve and continue. That's always been the same goal, and we're going to, we definitely are working towards that. One of the things, I'm sure you all had the same feeling, this initiative was conducted on a fairly accelerated timeline because we were aiming to implement any enhancements that we could by summer of 2022. And because of that, we've had to consider implementation challenges, and we've also had to ensure that we had adequate opportunity to fully understand the consequence of any changes we adopt based on both, policy considerations as well as additional analysis that may be needed to understand those consequences. Throughout the year, as you all know, we've been considering several changes, and by October, we felt we had a good design, and we put out our draft final proposal, but in response to comments that were submitted after we posted the draft final proposal, we decelerated the pace a little bit and took a little extra time so that we can address some of those concerns. And you'll see in today's discussion that we've actually addressed several areas of concerns that stakeholders raised in response to our last DFP, draft final proposal. And in particular, this additional time gave us some time to conduct some additional analysis and do a little bit of a deeper dive as to the factors behind when we pass the test and when we don't pass the test, in particular the events on July 9th, where we experienced the tightest conditions this past summer. So today you'll hear us discuss some significant changes from our prior version, and we believe that this will eliminate this overall package, including some of the changes we're considering previously, will significantly eliminate or reduce the possibility that the ISO will pass the resource efficiency evaluation, and in particular the capacity test, inappropriately during tight conditions. You'll see changes to the draft final proposal in 4 areas. The first is with regards to uncertainty, and you'll see as Danny and others will discuss greater detail today that we're considering suspending the inclusion of any of the uncertainty adders in the tests because of concerns related to the measurements of those uncertainties. The second area of changes you'll see is with regards to our prior proposal on demand response resources used to meet the test, and we are no longer considering those changes in light of concerns how this might impact participant EIM entities' ability to use demand response. The third category revolves around methodologies used for counting the resources that meet the test. And with respect to this third category, we are also considering some enhancements to ensure that what is offered and considered in what is considered in the test reflects what's actually available in the real-time market. So we're going to make some improvements to our prior proposal there. The fourth category, and this is a category where you'll hear that we're not proposing any changes, but we've made a lot of significant, we've learned a lot over the past couple of months on this, with regards to this particular area, and this is with regards to how conformance to load forecast impacts the real-time market. We're going to continue to work in this area. We don't have any changes we're proposing, but this additional time has given us an opportunity to better understand those issues as well. So we, in closing, I want to say that, we do recognize that this is not, our overall proposal here does not address all concerns. However, it is a significant improvement to provide significant improvements to the resource efficiency evaluation. And, what we've learned this past summer positions us very well for us to engage in continued discussions next year to work on improving the resource efficiency evaluation. And we will do so both with additional analysis that we'll provide earlier in the year, as well as the stakeholder initiative itself that we hope to engage in towards the end of the first quarter, second quarter of the year. But we will be continuing this dialogue throughout of next year. So with that, again, I want to thank you all for participating today right before the holiday and throughout the year. I hope you all have some time to relax and enjoy your time with your loved ones. Take some time in the next few weeks to re-energize. We at the ISO will be doing so, and we look forward to another very productive year in 2022 on market policy design. So thank you all, and happy holidays.
Great. Thank you, Anna. Okay, next we have Danny Johnson. He's going to provide a summary of the stakeholder comments that we received on the last proposal, and then changes, the details of the current proposal. So Danny, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Christina, and thank you, Anna, for your comments. Can we go to the next slide? So I am going to be providing an overview of the comments we received both to the draft final proposal as well as the MSC meeting and the workshop we conducted. It tracks similar to what is in the revised draft final proposal. So it starts out with some of the less controversial items and then moves into some of the items which we received more concern on through the comments. But before we get into that, I wanted to highlight another theme that we saw in our comments, both in the written comments and in those online discussions, and that is that the ISO's market clearing process just situates it differently compared to EIM entities. The ISO's market optimization, which includes HAPs, schedules and commit supply resources for the hour. So depending upon what the economics of that market run look like, it can use internal generation, it can commit imports that the CAISO interties, or it could rely on Eim transfers to meet the CAISO's capacity and flexibility needs. This unique situation and this different process compared to the base scheduling process EIM entities use, we think justifies and necessitates different treatment for the CAISO with regards to the balancing test, the treatment of interchange awards, the proposed use of demand response, as well as the consideration of low conformance. We will touch on all of these elements of the proposal a little bit later in this presentation. So starting off with the balancing test, we have received a lot of support for the CAISO's proposal to limit revenue allocation to entities that are exposed to the balancing test. The topic that we received stakeholder comment on was that the CAISO, as a balancing authority area that participates in the EIM, can still have its resources redispatched as a result of out-of-balance EIM entity base schedules in an attempt to true up and balance those schedules. Additionally, there's also the possibility for CAISO to be underscheduled as a result of its market clearing process to the extent that there's not sufficient supply to clear the market. I think both of these are valid concerns, but when we thought about this, we really went back to what is the intent of the balancing test. And the intent of the balancing test is to provide an incentive to align base schedules to forecasted demand. As the CAISO doesn't participate in the base scheduling process, while those two sub-bullets are valid, it would be inappropriate, we think, to apply the balancing test to the CAISO, but then at the same time, it would be equally inappropriate for the CAISO or any entity who is not exposed to the balancing test to have the potential to receive any revenue allocations that are derived from that test. So we think that this represents a balanced approach which both considers how the CAISO is differently situated and the intent of the balancing test isn't designed or really applicable to the CAISO, but also doesn't unduly benefit the CAISO through revenue allocation. Next slide. Stakeholders have also supported the CAISO's proposed changes to account for market constraint relaxations in the flexible ramp sufficiency test. The comments we received on this were more questions for clarification on how this would work or what the CAISO is really doing rather than disagreement with what the CAISO was proposing. We think that in the revised draft final proposal, we have added additional explanation that hopefully clarifies this, but on this call, I did want to just highlight again how this would work. The CAISO calculates the flexible ramp sufficiency test requirements using a reference interval and then the forecast in all of the 15-minute intervals in the subsequent hour. So to the extent that that reference interval immediately prior to that hour has a power balance constraint relaxation, the calculated forecast ramping needs that the test is testing for could be biased by that power balance constraint relaxation. We're simply looking to true up that difference so that this test is measuring an entity's ability to ramp from where we actually expect them to be and what their expected load forecast would be to what their forecasted load forecast would be, rather than a market schedule to the forecast. Next slide. So the majority of stakeholders have supported the CAISO's proposal to discount, for the purposes of passing the RSC, any import awards that don't have the transmission profile portion of an ETAG submitted by T40. In this proposal, we are expanding this slightly to be both import and exports awards, so we would consider this for all intertie schedules. This is done to align with the intertie deviation settlement rules, because that's how that policy that we're leveraging for the purposes of the RSC is set up. It also makes sense, just from a common sense perspective, if we're adding to the CAISO's obligations for passing the RSC, it would seem reasonable that the awardee who is getting that export has shown some intent to receive that export before the CAISO gets tested for being able to support it. We do recognize that commenters have raised concerns that the timing of this does not allow the CAISO a curing period to re-procure this supply for the purpose of passing the RSC. To the extent that these hourly import awards don't have an E-tag profile, their FMM schedules are zeroed out. These imports can be rebid as 15-minute imports. The FMM can clear residual supply to backfill this. However, both of those actions are kind of secondary actions that would take place after the RSEs run, given that we don't have certainty that they would occur because the rebidding of 15-minute imports is at the discretion of the importer, and the clearing of additional residual supply is dependent upon that supply being available. We don't think that it would be appropriate to count on these for the purposes of passing the RSE. This has kind of left us with thinking our original proposing to retain our original proposal of just discounting any awards that don't have the transmission profile highlighted at T40. I do see we have a question, so I think we can stop and go to Michelle.
Great, thank you. Yes, and before we go to Michelle, just a reminder, if you have a question and you're logged into WebEx, select the hand icon above the chat window. If you dialed in, you'll want to press pound 2, or you can send your question in the chat. So we'll go to Michelle first and see if others queue up.
All right, very good. I do see one question in queue. Michelle, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Thanks. Hey, Denny, this is Michelle from the CPUC. So one thing I've been having a little trouble understanding or struggling with is that the HASP imports are good enough to clear exports, but it seems odd that if they're good enough to clear exports, they're not good enough to support efficiency. So, I mean, I can go through an example that I'm thinking about, but do you have any thoughts before I go through that example? Do you understand?
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons that we'd want the export to at least have the transmission profile portion of a tag. I do understand your broader concern, which I think we're going to talk about later, which is just the interaction between HASP and the RSE and how exports that may not necessarily be able to be supported by supply internal to the CAISO BAA could be cleared, and how that could disadvantage the CAISO in passing the RSE. And I think we're aware of this, and we're currently looking into it and plan to address it in phase 2, but I don't think right now I'm going to be able to have an answer that you're satisfied with how we can true this up. This is still a TBD item for us.
Right, but it seems like maybe we shouldn't do the T-40 given the inconsistency. So like in my example, let's say California has 40,000 megawatts of load and 40,000 megawatts of resources. They have 2,000 megawatts of HASP imports, award 2,000 megawatts of HASP exports. And it's my understanding that those are then locked in. So for purposes of exporting the system, we're okay with those imports. So then let's go to, the RSE. Let's say half of those, 1,000 megawatts, didn't tag. Well, from an RSE perspective, we're going to fail, but we fail only because we're supporting those exports.
Yeah, I agree with the example that you've put forward, and I think it's something that we want to address. I don't know if that example really would invalidate our thought that imports should have a valid transmission, the valid transmission profile portion of an E-tag at T40. We zero out those imports regardless in the FMM. I think what you're highlighting is just how the HASP process clears exports could disadvantage the CAISO, which again is something that I think that we're going to need to address.
Right, but I guess I'm arguing that imposing this T-40 now is disadvantaging us because of the system that we have set up, which is to lock everything in the HASP at T-75 before we do the RSE. So I guess I'm saying, when you guys were thinking about resources in the stuck horizon, you were like, hey, we're going to, even though they're not physically available in the RSE timeframe, because they were available when you did the RSE, you're going to say that their bidding is okay. I feel like this is similar. We were resource sufficient when we headed into this, and those imports were available, and we did have sufficient resources. It's just because of what we committed, we failed the RSE.
Well, I think there is a difference with what you just highlighted, though. With our proposal to utilize the stuck horizon, those resources were bid in and could have been used by the market. Right here, we're trying to have a check to make sure that these import resources actually exist and aren't speculative. the stuck proposal and those stuck resources aren't speculative. Their bids were in the market and they were ready to go. They just weren't needed. Here we're trying to determine if the resources will actually show up.
Right.
And
I guess it
have
seems
a test that measures against that.
Yeah, I guess it seems like I think we need something to sort of have a fudge factor for the exports, right? So if we expect, as DMM has shown, that the imports that there's failure of imports tagging, right? That was their analysis. Then why are we supporting the exports on those, even though we expect failure?
Yeah, and I guess this is another two wrongs don't make a right. I agree with you that there's a problem with the way exports can clear the HASP and then be added to the CAISO's requirement. I don't think that necessarily means that we should count on imports that could be fictitious that we don't have good confidence of showing up.
Well, I guess I feel like this is a reliability issue, because if we potentially fail the RSE because of this and we can't get access to the EIM, I think that's a reliability issue. So I don't think we should do this before we have more clarity. I mean, we've also gotten rid of all the other things that you propose, like the all the other adjustments because of this issue. And it seems like this adjustment really just applies to CAISO, and it does implicate what you found at the end about, EIM advisory transfers supporting exports. I mean, it does implicate that. And it seems like if you're going to drop all those others, I think you should drop this one as well, because we haven't figured this out yet. So anyway, that's just my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.
All right. I do not see any other questions in queue currently. And I don't think I see any chat questions either, Christina.
Okay, well, if that's the case, then I think we can move forward. So stakeholders have supported largely the CAISO's proposal to classify some actions as emblematic of resource insufficiency. The actions that we identified previously were the deployment of reserves for energy and then backfilling those reserves with armed firm load. Some of the comments we received are that this is a little bit targeted to the actions that the CAISO has taken. Are there other potential actions that would demonstrate resource insufficiency? Beyond that, we thought about this for a little while, and it came up with one potential action, and this would be when a system operator directs voltage or reduces the voltage schedule below the nominal operating range for the purpose of reducing megawatt consumption. We think that this is definitely a demonstration of resource insufficiency, since it's only done in emergency conditions, and it does bring voltage security problems onto the table. We now have two potential operator actions that could demonstrate resource insufficiency. However, going into the second phase of this proposal, I think that we would open and welcome stakeholders submitting other operator actions that they think demonstrate resource insufficiency, so we can capture all the different ways the diverse set of BAAs operate their systems. I see that we have another question.
Yeah. Michelle, we'll go to Michelle's line. Michelle, can you hear us okay?
Hear you. Oh, sorry, now it's open. Okay, so my concern is sort of similar to the one I raised previous regarding emergency actions. So if we're doing this to address issues that have arisen both on August of 2020 and then July of 2021. And I would just note that, part of the issue, again, is this imports and exports issue. So on July 9th, we cleared the HASP, we cleared the exports, and then we lost the imports. And I guess it both didn't show up in HASP, and it also, the penalty parameters weren't correct. So we were supporting the exports, and we didn't have the imports. And so in that instance, we ended up in an EEA3 in part because we were supporting those exports that we didn't have sufficient resources to support. So I would note again that this is an instance that we went into EEA3, not necessarily because we were resource insufficient, but because of the market rules. So I'm concerned about implementing additional emergency actions until we've really gotten to the bottom of this idea of supporting the exports out of the HASP process and then supporting them through the FMM and the real-time market.
Thanks, Michelle. I recognize your concern, and to me, this just gets back to we need to figure out how to address the exports that come out of HASP. I can't credibly sit up here and say that when the CAISO is deploying its reserves as energy and is in an EEA2 or an EEA3 and doing that we should be able to exchange in mutually beneficial participation in the EIM. I think in that case, we are definitely in an energy emergency and a resource insufficient. Why we're in resource insufficient, again, gets back to that clearing process out of the HASP. I don't think that having a backstop to make sure that when entities are taking emergency actions, they can't continue to participate in the EIM is a good position as part of this initiative. Rather, I think this, again, just highlights our need to, on an expedited timeline, figure out the export problem.
Right. But we've taken out all the other things that affect, we're taking out the intertide deviation, we're taking out the uncertainty element, and we know that we have a problem, right? And so to me, rather than sort of compounding the problem, you have to address the root cause, which is the HASP exports. So to me, it seems like it makes sense to address that first, because I do think that this is going to become a reliability issue if we don't address it. And then this is only going to compound it by putting this sort of, this structure on a base that doesn't work. So that's my concern.
Yeah, and again, I think the issues you highlighted and some of the other proposed changes we're making, like removing intertide deviation uncertainty, is in direct relation to the calculation of intertide deviation uncertainty being inaccurate. And I think the feedback we receive is that shouldn't be part of the test. I don't think the idea of certain emergency actions like this being inaccurate is in question. It gets back to that underlying concern that we have to try to fix on an expedited timeline. So I recognize your concern, and I think it's going to be one of our primary objectives in 2022 is to try to fix that.
Okay, well, maybe I could ask this question. Do you guys hope to try to get that in place by this summer, because it could potentially be a reliability issue?
Our plan is to get the HASP changes in place by this summer.
Yeah.
I think to the extent that it's possible, we would aim to do that. I don't think that would be a reasonable timeline in which we could implement them on.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Danny, I don't see anybody else in the queue.
Okay.
But we do have one, I'm sorry to interrupt, we do have one question on the regular audio line.
Okay.
Caller, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Hi, Danny. This is Laura Trelease from the Bonneville Power Administration. And a couple of things, a comment on what Michelle was saying. I think Michelle hit on maybe a key difference on how the EIM entities are seeing the resource efficiency test and the EIM in general. I think this concern about if CAISO is not able to pass the resource efficiency test, that becomes a reliability issue. I think we're concerned about leaning and that entities should come in resource efficient and be able to meet their own obligations prior to engaging with the EIM. And so I think that needs to be the objective of the resource efficiency test, and that changes shouldn't be made based on whether or not that causes a reliability issue for a particular BA if they can't come in sufficient, because that wasn't the point of the EIM. My question is on the emergency actions. As far as, I'm curious why the CAISO feels the need to define whether or not there's an auto fail based on an emergency action rather than on whether or not they're in an energy emergency alert or have declared an emergency alert. Different operators take different actions, and it seems like pinpointing which operator actions would cause an auto fail seems to be a bit complex, and not sure how that's communicated by each EIM entity. And I was just wondering if you've considered using the declaration of an EEA or CAISO's equivalent AWE stages to determine the auto fail.
Thanks, Laura. So I think to the latter question that you just offered, it would be because different BAAs, the CAISO, have different stages of emergency. We wanted to tie this to the actions that would be taken by the system operators somewhere within the stages rather than blanket levels of emergency, recognizing that everybody or that BAAs can have different ways that they go into emergencies. On your former question, I would agree with you. We're trying to have the resource adequacy test if each entity has sufficient supply to meet their obligations. The concern Michelle is raising is that the obligations for the CAISO are biased against the CAISO via the CAISO's HAS clearing process, which is a real problem. But one of the reasons we're still going forward with some of these changes is we think that they improve the accuracy of the RSC test, and that we need to fix and revise that HAS clearing of exports more to just fix the way the CAISO's market works rather than trying to have a test that accounts for that.
Thanks. And if I'm not mistaken, I think CAISO put out some information last year or so on how CAISO declares emergencies and the equivalency to the NERC EEA definitions. And I think if I remember it correctly, with an NERC EEA stage 2, that's equivalent to a CAISO AWE stage 1. And then same with the CAISO AWE stage 2, that's equivalent to a NERC EEA 3. So couldn't you be able to do the crosswalk with the equivalent EEA based on the NERC standard?
I don't see any reason why we couldn't, but I don't see any reason why that's preferential to actually identifying the actions which collectively we agree demonstrate resource insufficiency.
Okay, it just seems like it's a simpler, cleaner, rather than going into everybody's operator actions to figure out whether or not they're insufficient or in an emergency situation. But I'll leave my comments there. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura.
All right, looks like we have one other person in the queue.
Yes, we do have a couple more questions in queue. Okay. Dan, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Hi, Danny. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. First, just wanted to say thank you for the excellent revised draft final proposal. Just as far as the written proposal that you put out was really clear and really well done in the completeness of it. So just wanted to give a little kudos on that. More broadly, though, just this issue that we've been discussing with Michelle and just with Laura around the exports and the clearing and HASP. I've been thinking about this quite a lot and was almost going to kind of raise it in the TSMSP discussion yesterday, but it feels like it's not something that can really be put in there, even though it has to do with exports. It just, I don't know, it seems like it's just really important to get phase 1 of that initiative kind of locked down and moved forward for implementation. But it also feels like the export issue is bigger and than just the EIN resource sufficiency implications of it. And I think, you're kind of saying the same thing, that it's something that needs to be addressed as an input to the RSC. But I guess where I'm kind of tripping up on this is just that it feels like it's a really important issue, and that if it was something that had been discovered, in late 2020 or early 2021, it would have been included in the Summer Readiness 2021 initiative and kind of put as a top priority for the CAISO to do something about, because of the potential impacts to reliability and also just to kind of fairness and price formation and that sort of thing. So I guess the comment is just to encourage that there be some investigation of whether it could be a special initiative that could be committed to for sort of a summer 2022 readiness type of a stance. recognizing you have a huge amount of things on your plate with EDAM and other work, but it really does feel like this is something that's been uncovered that's important for reliability, important for market fairness, and needs to be addressed, but outside of just the narrow resource sufficiency implications of it.
Thanks for your comments, Dan. I agree with everything you said. I think if we would have found this coming out of those August 2020 events, this would have been something that we looked to address in the summer enhancements for summer 2021, or would have been one of the front and center items for the phase one of this initiative that we're trying to address. I'm happy we discovered it when that we were able to discover it. I wish it would have happened earlier, but I don't know if I can commit to another stakeholder process to address this by summer 2022. I think I need to defer to my management on that because, as you noted, we have a fairly aggressive roadmap for the early part of next year. But given the impact of this and how it does cross-cut on the way exports are looked at from the TSM perspective as well as the RSC, I can assure you it will be a priority for the CAISO going forward.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think also too, part of the concern, just last thing to note, is that you have significantly more transfer capacity coming in with the next class of EIM participants that'll be onboarding in March, April timeframe, and that there is a potential that the issue gets exacerbated by that increase in transfer capacity and what that could do to the market clearing this summer. So it's just another reason that I feel like it's worth looking into. So thanks.
Thanks, Dan.
All right, we're moving to the next question in queue. Steve, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Thanks, Steve Kearns, Public Generating Pool. I got a couple things I want to hit on real quick here. First, I want to support the comments I've heard from Dan and others so far about it's nice to see that the HASP export issue has been identified, and we agree at PGP that this is something that we'd like to get resolved sooner rather than later. Second point I want to make is back to Laura's point about relying on an EA declaration rather than specific actions to trigger the freezing of transfers. This was something that PGP commented on, I think, in the straw proposal, and I thought that the answer that we got about why it was preferable to use the actions was that CAISO didn't want to blur the lines between market operator and reliability coordinator functions. At the time, I thought that made a lot of sense, and I thought relying on actions then was a sufficient proxy for freezing transfers. But I would like to go back and to Laura's point that EEA declaration would be a lot cleaner way to do it. And if there is no concern about blurring the lines between market operator and RC functions, then maybe you should reconsider the EEA declaration. Finally, sorry, I just want to hit all three real quick and then you can jump in. Finally, I want to get back to some of the points Michelle made about the two issues we've talked so far about the tagging at T-40 and the emergency action declaration. I think Laura might have hit on this, but each one of these items we've talked about has a discrete reason why these are being addressed. The T-40 was to hopefully try to eliminate speculative supply, which is a reliability issue in itself. So PGP totally supports implementing the T-40 tagging deadline. And same thing with the emergency actions as being a signal that you aren't resource efficient. So I understand Michelle's point about trying to get at the HASP export, but I don't think that should get in the way of implementing these two changes.
Thanks, Steve, and sorry for interrupting there in the middle. To the EEA point, yeah, thank you for bringing that back up. And that was one of the reasons that we wanted to keep it separate and targeted on actual actions.
Okay, thanks.
I think that was our last question. And I don't see anything in the chat, Annie.
Okay.
Yes, that was the final question that I can see. No additional questions in queue.
Great. So moving forward, throughout this entire process, stakeholders have offered strong support to not count offline resources for the purposes of passing the RSE. There's a nuance between stakeholders on where a resource and when it's actually considered offline. There are some stakeholders that maintain the test should only count resources that are available to be started by the upcoming hour. So within that RSE horizon, the CAISO would view resources as offline if they weren't offered and available and could be accessed by its real-time market, the longest horizon of which is the stuck. Our thinking here is that we do not want to create incentives for any market participants to deviate from those optimal schedules, either through deviating from schedules or manual dispatch, just for the purposes of passing the RSE. Instead, we would want to credit and count those resources since they were ultimately made available to the real-time market. We are proposing to go forward and count the maximum the bid max of these resources that are offline but could have been accessed by the real-time market at the time of the RSE. We did hear concern on that this could potentially over-credit the capacity through this process. So we plan to actually make this a configurable parameter within the BPM to allow us the ability to change and count a lower amount than the bid max to the extent that some of these resources that could have been started by stuck would not have been able to achieve their maximum output by the time the RSEs run. I see a question in the queue. Let's go to Michelle.
All right, absolutely. Michelle, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Thank you. So I just wanted to address the last issue about the speculative supply. And so I just wanted to note that CPUC jurisdictional RA imports must be delivered. And if you look at the summer reports done by the CAISO, for the most part, like 99.9% of the imports did deliver. So they weren't speculative supply. But I'm also concerned about speculative supply, but I'm concerned about it in a different way. So, and it comes back to the imports and exports. Let's say you have speculative imports that come in and support exports, and the CAISO system has to support those speculative imports when they don't show up. So it leans on the CAISO system. So that's precisely why I'm concerned about this HASS process, is because of those speculative imports that California load ultimately has to support if they don't show up. So I just want to address that. So that's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. I do think that the accounting for both Eim transfers that can support the exports as well as potentially speculative imports is something that we would look to account for when we try to figure out how to true up the HASS export clearing process in the RSE. The one other item I wanted to add on this slide is this configurable counting will be only for the resources that are credited through this stuck process that are made available, but not utilized by the real-time market. For resources that are online or could be online, we think that the flexible ramp sufficiency test does account for how much capacity these resources are able to achieve. Next slide. So stakeholders have also raised concern with some of the penalties we put forward around how demand response and the demand response functionality that we're offering. They have concerns that it can create unwarranted risk if there's large amounts of forecast error. If you remember, our original proposal was to treat a EIM entity forecast that has a demand response load modification as an EIM entity generated forecast. It would then skip the balancing test and have the underscheduling test automatically applied. Commenters pointed out to us that the conditions which you may use demand response would correlate to stress system conditions when you have a higher chance of load forecast error. They didn't want to put their operators in a situation where they're trying to gauge how accurate is the forecast. Is it going to be within 5% to allow me to use my DR to pass the RSE? We agree that that's not a reasonable or good position to put the operators in. So we are proposing to no longer have targeted penalties for the use of demand response. Underscheduling will continue to be applied per the current design, so it would be applied following a failure of the balancing test. I think that there is still the potential for misuse of this functionality, because to the extent that the DR doesn't show up, it could be used to pass the RSE and then would be simply settled as imbalance energy. However, we're planning to use our normal monitoring process to see if these concerns are founded, and to the extent that they are, would look in phase 2 to design a more targeted penalty structure for the misuse of this demand response functionality. I see a couple questions in the queue, so we can go to the phone lines.
I do see a question in the regular audio queue, so we're going to go to that question first. Caller, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Hi, Danny. It's Laura Trelease from the Bonneville Power Administration again. And just on your last slide on using the SPEC, the EIM entities had requested some counterfactual analysis of the highest load days in summer 2021 in the afternoon hours to show, what capacity was counted, what was not actually operationally available, what was counted using the STEC, what was counted using the RTEC. And I was just wondering if the CAISO considered that request.
Yeah, Laura, the CAISO has considered this, and I think this is analysis that we plan to do going into 2022. We just, with the truncated schedule of this, that came in the middle of October. We haven't had time with the other analysis to conduct those high load days. I actually think that what you suggested will go a long way to kind of informing how big of an impact the use of load conformance has. What is the actual impact of the exports that get cleared by HASP in relation to the CAISO's requirements? I think that analysis will be done, but it'll be done as part of this broader analysis to figure out the interaction between the market and the ISO.
Okay, thank you.
All right. We do have an additional phone question in queue, so I will go to that one as well. Caller, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Hi, Danny. This is Ryan from PGE. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Ryan. Hi.
Just wanted to say that PGE really appreciates the CAISO's work on this, referring back to the demand response and your recognition of the importance of incorporating demand response as part of the initiative. With that in mind, I just want to ensure that there's alignment between the intent of the policy and the way the policy is actually applied. On page 26 of the proposal, the CAISO states that it will provide an entity the ability to adjust the demand forecast used by the RSE to account for DR programs that are not currently able to be represented within the CAISO market. It kind of occurred to us that statement could be read two ways. The first being that the resources are not currently able to be represented because they haven't built a proxy demand response resource, even though they know it could potentially be a PDR, or they're not currently able because there isn't a current peak time rebate program that will never be a CAISO resource because it's behavioral. So from an implementation standpoint, can you confirm that the intent of the first option was to allow entities to adjust their forecast for DR programs that aren't represented because they don't yet have them registered through the existing PDR model?
I think our intent was to allow all DR programs that EIM entities use to be represented as they see fit. To the extent that they want them to become PDR, I think that we would encourage that because getting the resources into the market would be beneficial. To the extent that they either don't want to do that or they cannot do that, we want to give them an avenue to represent the DR that they expect to occur going into the real-time horizon and account for that in the RSE.
Great, that's helpful. I think the PDR registration process is the long-term goal, but in the interim, we just wanted to make sure that we had the ability to adjust our load forecast so that we could account for that DR program. So that's helpful clarification. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you.
All right. We are moving to the next question in queue. And it looks like Libby has a question to ask. Libby, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Great, thank you. This is Libby Kirby from Bonneville. I had a question, Danny. You mentioned that the configuration ability will only be applied to resources. It sounded like you said they were only applied to resources that would be offline, but not ones that would be online or could be online. Can you talk a little more about that? It looks like in the proposal, you were considering counting the full capacity in all of the examples except the one where it was offline and couldn't be started in a longer time period than the was it a 3 or 4 hours period? And I'm wondering, I guess I just kind of got lost on what was counting. It sounded like we were saying the ones that you wouldn't have counted the capacity for in the examples would be the ones that we would be able to be configured, but it seems like the configuration would make more sense on the pieces where you're expecting to currently count the full capacity, even if they're decommitted by stuck, and can't be online in real time.
So our proposal with the configurable capacity counting would apply to the resources that fall into that bucket that could have only been started up by the stuck. So between that 4.5 hours and the start of the RTUC horizon, about an hour and 45 minutes out. With regard to the resources that are online or able to be started by the RTUC process, we're not proposing any changes. We think the FlexRent sufficiency test does work together in concert with the capacity test to not allow an entity to pass the RSC in full if those resources are overcounted in the capacity test. So it would only be for the offline resources that are started by stuck.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense. And given that you've made it configurable and we've expressed some concerns about using the max capacity, is this something that as part of the analysis next year you're expecting to look back at? I think the concern, at least one of the concerns that I have, is the idea that the uncertainty that's being reflected in the RSE test is only looking at the short-term uncertainty, but decisions are being made about what should be on or offline hours ahead of that. And so if the uncertainty is only looking at that short-term, FMM versus RTD type stuff, that there's, by counting the capacity but not reflecting the uncertainty of the timing with which you make the decision, that's where some of that overcounting is happening. So I'm wondering if you're expecting, since you've made it configurable, that there will be further analysis, and maybe that was the answer to Laura's question, but I just want to confirm.
I don't know if we're going to, not committing to further analysis on this. My suspicion is the analysis will most likely roll out of future tight days and kind of the deep dive we did on July 9th or last August, where there are certain resources that are routinely counted that shouldn't be counted. So I think the proposal would not count most of those resources, but to the extent that there is still residual supply that's getting overcounted, we would investigate that, and to the extent that there's resources that would never have been able to achieve their maximum output, we would move the counting to something lower at that time.
Okay. We'll take that back and chew on it. Thanks.
Okay.
All right, Michelle, anybody else?
I do not see any additional questions in the queue or anything in the chat.
Okay, thank you. Slide 13.
Yes. So the next topic is on intertie uncertainty. Right before we put out the draft final proposal, we put out literally minutes before some analysis on the intertie deviation uncertainty adder. I think that analysis did show that the 90-day look back in combination with the 95% confidence interval wasn't necessarily predicting future uncertainty at anywhere near a 95% confidence level. That was echoed in a lot of the stakeholder comments we heard in the verbal discussions as well as the written comments. We also got feedback that the existing process to exclude outlier data isn't functioning as designed. The ability for EIM entities to set up a shadow calculation that's able to replicate what the ISO does is not straightforward with the volume of tags. They've had some difficulty doing this, so they may not be able to identify any outliers that should be excluded. All this feedback has kind of led us to the position that we think that we should suspend the intertie uncertainty deviation adder, or actually remove it as part of phase 1 of this initiative. I think we would look to reincorporate this in phase 2. There were proposals that I think likely are a better design than our existing design that came in from that draft final proposal written comments. However, we want to have the chance to stakeholder that through a couple iterations and get feedback on the different options we have to account for this type of uncertainty. And we think the second phase of this proposal is the appropriate place to do that. The one other thing I would mention here in that last sub-bullet is that the intertie uncertainty and the net load uncertainty both use a 95% confidence level. This means that we are excluding only the 0.5% of under deliveries for intertie uncertainty or net load variation. That's a 1 in 40 and 1 in 40 probability. These are both being applied to the test non-coincidentally, which means when you holistically look at the uncertainty between both, it's almost a 1 in 1,600 probability, which I think may be a little extreme for the RSE, which is just trying to test if an entity has sufficient capacity an hour and 40 minutes out from the end of that operating hour. So I think that addressing this and then some of the changes we're proposing for the net load uncertainty in phase 2 will give us the opportunity to consider both of these in concert and make sure that we're accounting for the right total level of uncertainty. The next slide is on the net load uncertainty. Stakeholders in their comments have raised concerns that the continued use of the histogram methodology to calculate net load uncertainty has led to a increase in frequency and magnitude of test failures that isn't commensurate with the accuracy benefits that we thought that this would create. This was actually an issue that we identified during the market enhancements for summer of 2021 proposal. The rationale at that time was the quantile regression methodology coming in the fall of 2021 and the potential to increase the accuracy in the summer of 2021 kind of outweighed this this problem with the histogram methodology. I think that what we found is that the histogram methodology problem actually outweighs the accuracy benefit. In addition, the quantile regression methodology is being delayed until the fall of 2022. Given this, we're planning to use our existing FERC authority to immediately suspend the net load uncertainty adder from the capacity test. I think we want to go a little bit further too, and we, in phase 2, will look to have some calculation for net load uncertainty. To us at the ISO staff, we think the quantile regression methodology will be a pretty good measure of net load uncertainty. However, prior to implementing any new adder for net load uncertainty, we want to ensure that the entire stakeholder community is comfortable with the uncertainty adder that's going to get added to avoid a repeat of what occurred this summer. So we would allow a little bit of time to get that methodology in place and to ensure that stakeholders are comfortable with it. To the extent that they are, we could use that as a measure of uncertainty for the capacity test. To they're not, I think the ISO would be open to creating a ROC capacity test specific measure of uncertainty if that's where stakeholders think we need to land. I'd like to stop right there and see if we have any questions.
Sure. Do we have anybody in the verbal queue?
I do not see any questions in queue currently.
Okay.
Questions? Okay.
All right, so the last topic we're going to discuss is load conformance. As Anna identified, this is one of the items that stakeholders raised concern of, which we are not planning on changing our proposal of. I'm going to kind of walk through some of the background on this and then some of the ISO's rationale on why it would be inappropriate to account for load conformance at this time. If this seems like a refresher given some of our, or repetitive given some of our recent discussions at the MSC and the workshop, I apologize, but I want to make sure that everybody has an understanding of why CAISO uses load conformance. And it's used in the HAS to ensure we have sufficient unload capacity and flexibility. The results of load conformance are to either increase hourly imports the CAISO has. The converse of this would be a decrease in hourly exports. It can commit additional internal generation to the CAISO BAA or redispatch the generation internal to the CAISO BAA. The third outcome is the Eim transfers that this can drive. This can drive an uptick in Eim transfers. This is the CAISO's market-based mechanism that our system operators use to ensure that they have the flexibility that they need or whatever they need to operate the system going forward. Eim entities, we feel, can already achieve a lot of these outcomes through their bilateral and base scheduling processes. To the extent that they want additional generation online, they are simply able to reflect that in their base schedule. They can control their imports and exports also through that bilateral process, which also does give them the ability to ensure that they are not scheduling bilateral exports that would prevent them from passing the RSE, which is something we've identified as an issue that CAISO's struggling to resolve. Next slide. However, stakeholders in multiple venues have reiterated their preference to include load conformance in phase 1 of the RSE. The CAISO disagrees that its blanket use of load conformance should provide a barrier to its ability to engage in EIM transfers. The RSE is testing if the CAISO can meet its forecasted demand and export obligations. To the extent that CAISO uses load conformance to secure additional imports or commit additional internal generation, we do not feel that that should raise its barrier to participate in the EIM. We think that these are outcomes that are analogous to what EIM entities can currently do through their bilateral and base scheduling practices. We do, however, agree that to the extent that load conformance can drive EIM transfers, which unload resources internal to the Cal ISO BAA, that could be shown as additional upward flexibility and aided in passing the flex ramp test, that is something that we need to account for and make sure that the CAISO is not able to use to more easily pass the flex ramp sufficiency test. However, as we discussed at the MSC meeting and the workshop, these are some pretty complex market interactions. A lot of additional analysis is needed. I think right now we have one data point which shows that it's about a 30% correlation to EIM transfers that result from load conformance. I think before we would go forward and add a firm requirement to the CAISO, we would want to have a lot more than one data point informing what that requirement is. Next slide. And finally, we've already talked about this at length. There are market interactions between the way the CAISO clears paths and the RSE, which we think need to be addressed in concert with load conformance. I think from the CAISO's perspective, these already disadvantage the CAISO in its ability to pass the RSE. Trying to add even a 30% of load conformance on top of this just moves the RSE farther away from its goal of testing the actual obligations for load and exports the CAISO can support prior to participating in the EIM. The real issue just gets back to the fact that those exports can go to EIM or non-EIM BAAs. They count against the CAISO. To the extent they're backed by internal generation, great, the CAISO may be able to support these. To the extent they're backed by access to EIM transfers, this simply adds to the CAISO's requirements in passing the RSE without an addition of supply equal to the requirement. Further, as Dr. Scott Harvey has pointed out, I think at our last call, there are other market interactions which may be driving EIM transfers at the extent of internal generation. I think one of the things he identified is the current implementation of the flexible ramp product may lead to systemically higher FRP prices internal to CAISO. To the extent that's true, that would drive additional EIM imports rather than resources internal to the CAISO. I think all of these things need a lot of additional analysis. As Anna mentioned and as we put out, we are not planning on waiting till phase 2 of this initiative to try to get to the bottom of this. We are going to be conducting this analysis probably right at the start of the new year through the spring. I think that we would look to, through workshops or meetings, publish this analysis and disseminate it and make sure everybody understands. To the extent that we can all coalesce about how this should be implemented quickly, I think we'd look to implement something quickly. To the extent that we need to stakeholder what the design changes we need based off this analysis, we would do that as part of phase 2 of this initiative. So I do see a question in the queue from Jeff, so can we go to Jeff?
Absolutely. Jeff, your line's unmuted. You may go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, Danny. It's Jeff Spires with PowerX. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. I just wanted to make a higher level comment related to next steps with this initiative. Just looking at the proposal and where we are now, it seems like there are a couple of challenges that we continue to face with the initiative. The first one is that there are a number of issues that aren't yet resolved and need more time to work through. A good example of that is the net load uncertainty that you were talking about a slide or two back. I think many of the EIM entities appreciate the CAISO's willingness to disable that functionality temporarily out of the concerns around the accuracy of that calculation. But at the same time, it is an important element of the test, and trying to find an accurate calculation and reintroduce that into the test as soon as possible is something that is important. And likewise, with the discussion with Laura earlier around the stuck horizon and being able to more clearly understand whether that solution is achieving its intended result and is actually effective at getting us to a place that we all feel comfortable with is something that I think is important to a lot of entities, as I think they see that proposal as a step in the right direction, but it's just very hard to say beyond that, is it the right solution and how effective will it be? I think the other sort of just high level challenge we have is there are some areas, including the conformance that you're just talking about now, where CAISO's perspective seems to be different from what the majority of the EIM entities view as being an accurate framework, or how an RS framework should incorporate some of these topics, including load conformance, and as well as, I think some of the discussion we had at the last workshop around just more from a principled point of view, whether or not being short the necessary supply to meet load in the FMM constitutes leaning or not. These are some important topics that I think need more discussion. And so I think that, the perspective is that I think you're likely to hear in the written comments, based on some of the discussions we've had so far on this, is I think there's an appreciation for the enhancements that the CAISO is proposing, and we appreciate those, but there is also a number of challenges remaining that haven't been addressed, and it seems like more work is needed. So I just wanted to reiterate what I said last time, which is I would really urge you to consider a more formal phase 1B, where we could move forward with implementing the enhancements in this proposal, but it would come with, at the same time, a commitment to solve the remaining issues and try to get to the point where there is consensus and comfort with the test, and that the CAISO and the EIM entities and stakeholders generally think the test is functioning as intended, it's accurate, it's properly measuring each BA's sufficiency ahead of the EIM. I think that's really important because it is challenging to ask the stakeholders to support something that is incomplete without really having clarity or certainty about how the remaining issues will get resolved and when. So I just want to reiterate that I think trying to add some clarity and some commitment to continuing to work on these remaining items is something that should be considered.
Thanks, Jeff. I do think that the CAISO is committed to resolving these items. I think the framework of how we go out with releasing additional analysis in the spring is something that we need to think about internally, but we are planning on doing the analysis that will inform the latter portions of this design. So your comment that this is an incomplete policy, I wouldn't disagree, but I'd ask you to consider this policy in respect to what's in place right now in the RSC, not what the most idolized version of an RSC design is. I think, as we discussed, some of these items just are going to take more time because we need to do more analysis and think more carefully about these market interactions. We want to make sure that we are able to do that while also trying to improve other elements of the RSC that aren't as controversial or there aren't outstanding questions on as quickly as possible, which is, I think, why we're planning to go forward with the phase 1 proposal as it is. But thank you for your comments, and I think we will be in touch regarding the additional analysis that we will need to do to try to sort this issue out.
Okay. Thanks, Danny. Appreciate it.
Sure.
We do have additional questions in queue if you're ready to take them.
Yeah,
Steve, your line's unmuted. You may go ahead.
Yeah, this is Steve Kearns from Public Generating Pool again. I just wanted to add some support to the point that Jeff was just making regarding there being value of packaging some of these work streams for additional analysis for net load uncertainty and load conformance in kind of its own better organized stakeholder process. And whether or not we call it phase 1B or phase 2A, I don't really care, but I think there is value in getting a little bit better organized around it. So think about that and take it for what it's worth.
Okay, thank you, Steve.
We do have another question in queue. Dan, your line's unmuted. You may go ahead.
Hi, Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. So kind of more of a tangential question around load conformance, and that's just whether CAISO's had some internal discussions about going into this coming summer, whether there's an opportunity to address the conformance sort of at the root cause level, and to work with system operators to explore other ways of achieving what needs to be achieved for reliability purposes. And I ask that just knowing that we've added 2,500 megawatts of very fast responding flexible resources that should be helping CAISO meet its ramping needs from the storage fleet, and expect that significantly more will be added by this coming summer. So I'm curious if there's been any discussion of sort of the expectations of whether you'll still need to be doing conformance to meet the ramping needs when those resources are available. And then also just looking at other things that could be done in the pre-HASP horizon or within HASP that you do on certain other days around exceptional dispatch or out-of-market purchases at the ties, or any of those things that could sort of limit the magnitude of sort of persistent conformance that's going on, while doing as was suggested to keep working on the interplay with the resource sufficiency evaluation in the future.
Thanks, Dan. So I think that one of the things that we think will partially solve the problem will be the FRP refinements that is scheduled to go in the fall of 2022. With regard to the changing resource mix and our changing in load conformance, I've not been party to any discussions about changing operator practices, but I think that's something that I can at least raise to that group. And in regards to the last point that you had regarding other actions, that's where this is hard, because the ISO could manually dispatch resources or ED resources to not conform load. That has the same function of getting these resources online, but from our perspective, it's just inefficient and more work for the system operator. If they put in a load conformance for 1,000 megawatts, they ideally get 1,000 megawatts of additional supply. They're not having to pick and choose what is the most efficient 1,000 megawatts of additional supply they get out of all the bids that they have. The software is doing that for them. So I think that's one of the reasons that they are using load conformance as they are, instead of just EDing or manually dispatching all these different resources.
Yeah, and from comments I've made over the years, I definitely am not one to advocate for out-of-market solutions, but we're in that don't impact LMP and that sort of thing. But we're in this unique situation where it's like, in the past, you could use load conformance because you didn't have to worry about the Eim transfers being committed sort of in front of hourly block imports that were offered in the intertie market. But now we are where we are, and unless there's some way to sort of skip over the Eim transfers and commit in that capacity, you're just not getting the response that you used to. So it's almost, I guess, I'm looking for more conversation around interim solutions that recognizing if we can't get a good way of dealing with load conformance around the resource sufficiency and around the Eim transfers for this summer, are there other ways to get at it? And also, do we kind of hope that the storage fleet is going to help get rid of the need for it anyway?
Okay, well, those are items we can think about if there's any internal practice changes we can make that can help address this issue too.
Sounds good. Thanks again, Danny.
Thanks, Dan.
And we do yes, I'm sorry. We do have an additional hand that just pops up on the regular audio line.
Go ahead.
All right. Caller, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Hi, Danny. It's Laura Trelease at Bonneville, and I just want to second the comment that Jeff made about a Phase 1B, and definitely appreciate your comment about these are incremental improvements to the current test and the fact that the remaining issues need more analysis and discussion, and we agree with that. But I don't want to lose sight of the fact that, the EIM resource efficiency test is so foundational to the EIM and it being a voluntary market. And I think Elliot said it best at the beginning of this initiative when he talked about it's really about trust and confidence in the market. And I think just given the importance of getting to an accurate test and an effective test, we'd really like to urge the CAISO as well to consider prioritizing this effort and the remaining issues and doing that in a Phase 1B before Phase 2. Phase 2 is really intended to talk about failure consequences, and before we can really have a robust discussion about failure consequences, we really got to get to a test that's accurately reflecting the operating capability and the obligations of each VA, and we just haven't quite gotten there in this phase. And so I just wanted to tag on for support for a Phase 1B.
Thanks, Laura. I think given the feedback we've heard on this, that's something that I can take back and we can chew on and see if there is the opportunity to do something other than Phase 2.
All right. It looks like we do have another question in queue. Michelle, your line's unmuted. You may go ahead.
Yeah, so I just have a question. So I'm just wondering if to get to the bottom of load conformance, you actually have to get to the bottom of imports and exports. So, I mean, to the extent that the operator is doing load conformance because it assumes that some imports are going to fail or that it has to support exports or something like that, don't you have to get to the bottom of that before that issue, potential problem, before you can address the load conformance? I mean, because if that's partially driving it, isn't that part of the issue? Just wondering if they're sort of interrelated.
I don't know if they're interrelated in the way that your example would suggest, Michelle, but I do believe that the issue should be addressed at the same time. I think a lot of the analysis that would be conducted for either of them kind of informs the other issues. So I think we would look to address these at the same time.
Okay, thanks so much.
All right. I do not currently see any additional questions in queue.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. And if anybody does have any additional questions, feel free to queue up. So as far as the decisional designation, the ISO does believe that the EIM governing body has joint authority with the ISO Board of Governors over the tariff rule changes for the Phase 1 proposal. This designation was determined based on the changes that will be applicable to the EIM balancing authority areas, EIM entities, or market participants within the EIM entity balancing authority areas in their capacity as participants in the EIM. And so based on that, we're actually planning to take this proposal to a joint governance meeting at the end of February. We are looking for stakeholder comments on the revised draft final proposal. Those are going to be due January 10th. I'll work with Danny to get a comment template out on the initiative webpage the next, by end of today. And so if you could use that comment template to submit your comments, we greatly appreciate it. So any other comments or questions before we conclude the meeting today?
I do not see any questions in the chat. I also don't see any questions in the verbal queue.
No problem. So if you do have any questions, any follow-up questions, of course, you can reach out to either myself or ISO Stakeholder Affairs at CAISO.com. And we do wish you a happy holiday season. Thanks for all your comments and participation today. We do look forward to those comments in writing. Again, those are due January 10th. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Happy holidays.